Hello and good afternoon. I'm Kyle Ferrier. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs and Research here at KEI. And let me be the first to welcome many of you to our new office. And I hope you can join us next Tuesday from 4:30 to 6:30 as we host our open house reception to showcase our new space. And also, if the topic of today's program is of interest to you, I highly encourage you to join us again on Monday, October 16th for a discussion on how North Korea is reported in the media. As part of KEI's mission to further U.S.-Korea relations, I have the good fortune to travel around the U.S. to engage with a variety of different audiences. And I recently just got back from a 2-week trip that took me to Georgia and South Carolina. And a concern that was consistently raised on that trip was the potential transfer of North Korean's nuclear technology to terrorist groups and other non-state actors. And because North Korea transactions take place in the shadows, it's also a concern shared by many here in D.C. Now, with us today to shed some light on North Korea's ties with non-state actors by outlining the development of these relationships stemming back from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il, now to Kim Jong-un, is Ben Young. His presentation will be based on a paper he has written for us as part of our academic paper series. And if you haven't picked up a copy of his paper, I would highly encourage you to do so before you leave on your way out. Ben is a PhD candidate in Asian history at George Washington University, where he is writing his dissertation on North Korea's relations with with the global South from 1962 to 1994. He also recently returned from spending a year as a Fulbright junior researcher, and more information about Ben and his research interests and his work can be found in the flyer for today's program. So I'm now going to turn things over to Ben, who will start us off with a presentation, and we'll have some time after for a Q&A session. Thank you.
Before I start my presentation, I just want to take a moment to thank the Korea Economic Institute for putting on this event and publishing my paper in their academic paper series. A special thanks goes to Kyle, who assisted me in all stages of this paper and provided valuable feedback throughout the process. He truly helped me make my paper better. When I first started thinking about submitting a paper to the KEI's academic paper series, I wanted to combine my specialization in history with a policy-relevant topic. Luckily, when it comes to North Korea, it's hard to run out of newsworthy and policy-relevant content these days. However, I found that a lot of North Korea-related content in the current news cycle suffers from what I would call historical amnesia. That is, anything that North Korea does is perceived as new or different or rare or surprising. And I think using a historical lens can better inform the public about North Korea's intentions and strategies, and more importantly, make sure our policymakers here in Washington do not accidentally propel themselves into a war on the Korean Peninsula. Before I get into the body of my paper, I just want to make a note about sources. As a historian, sources are our main tool. Without sources, we have no narrative. However, when it comes to the secretive nature of North Korea, sources are a problem. Luckily, we do have archival materials from the former Eastern Bloc, the U.S. National Archives here in College Park, the ROK Foreign Ministry Archives, and the Canadian Foreign Ministry Archive. Thus, ironically, the Kim Il-sung period is one of the easiest time periods to research when it comes to North Korean history. The further back you go in North Korean history, the more sources you have available. For the Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un periods, I use mostly journalistic works and publicly available sources. And when you combine the secretive nature of North Korea and the secretive nature of non-state actors, it becomes even more difficult to trace linkages between the two parties. But hopefully I try to do the best I can in my paper. As we all know, North Korea's isolation is an outlier in a globalizing world. Due to the information blockade imposed on its citizens and its outdated system of government, North Korea, officially known as the DPRK, is often described as Orwellian or Stalinist. These Cold War terms, although useful at times, neglect a fundamental part of the North Korean worldview. After the consolidation of Kim Il-sung's power in the 1960s, the North Korean government was committed to the ethos of guerrilla fighting and assisting non-state actors in their own struggles for sovereignty and independence. This strategy, what this paper terms guerrilla internationalism, combines revolutionary fervor and brutal pragmatism. During the Cold War, North Korea fomented revolutionary fervor by training and providing military equipment to communist guerrillas and anti-colonial liberation movements. And after the collapse of the communist bloc, North Korea turns attention to assisting Islamist militants such as Hezbollah and Hamas. This commitment to assisting non-state actors opened spaces for the Kim family regime to sell weapons, earn hard currency, and undermine its chief enemy, the United States. However, Kim Jong-un has shifted away from this transition of assisting non-state actors and now focuses on selling arms to various nation-states through front companies. This suggests Kim Jong-un does not share his forefathers' revolutionary idealism and that brutal pragmatism guides his policymaking decisions. North Korea's founder, Kim Il-sung, built his reputation as a Korean nationalist during the anti-Japanese guerrilla movement of the 1930s. These experiences, fighting the Japanese in the mountains of Manchuria, undeniably shaped and informed the young Kim Il-sung's anti-colonial worldview. And after the defeat of the Japanese in 1945, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung as the leader of the DPRK. Kim soon surrounded himself with partisans from his anti-Japanese guerrilla days and later purged the pro-Chinese and pro-Soviet factions from the DPRK government. This led to the creation of what Wada Haruki first called the guerrilla band state in the 1960s, in which the leadership applied characteristics of guerrilla warfare to DPRK government policy. The anti-colonial experiences of the DPRK's leadership, with Kim Il-sung at its center, also molded their foreign policy and explains why a small, developing, and geographically remote country assisted liberation fighters around the world during the Cold War era. Unlike other small client states, Soviet client states such as Bulgaria, North Korea devoted a large number of resources to aiding guerrilla fighters in Latin America, Africa, and Southern Asia. While there is no watershed event that signals North Korea's entry into the world of revolutionary assistance, the 1966 Tricontinental Conference of African, Asian, Latin peoples held in Havana, Cuba, stands out as a call to arms for non-aligned leftist regimes around the world. Delegations from 83 countries, including the DPRK, attended this conference. And at this meeting of third world countries, delegations agreed that subversion in the internal affairs of other countries, whether it was by peaceful or political violence, was permissible. A resolution at the conference also called for the establishment of training schools for foreign revolutionaries, which the DPRK later started. This break from communist orthodoxy gave third world nations the green light to intervene in the internal affairs of other nations to further the anti-imperialist cause. Thus, this Tricontinental Conference had far-reaching reverberations around the world, especially in Pyongyang. After 1966, North Korea's role in international revolution grew significantly, particularly in Africa and Latin America. For example, during the late 1960s, North Korea covertly trained and supplied anti-government rebels in northern Chad with weapons. And during the course of my presentation, I'm going to be bringing up maps just to have some background geographic information for everyone. So paradoxically, the North Koreans were trying to establish an embassy around the same time that they were supplying and supporting anti-government rebels in Chad. Chadian President Francois Tomobaye met with North Korean officials in 1969 and urged them to stop aiding rebels in the country. The North Koreans denied the charges and cautioned Tomobaye to be wary of American imperialists who forged and spread various documents against democratic peoples. Meanwhile, U.S. officials urged the Chadian president to keep his distance from the duplicitous North Koreans and warned of, quote, the danger in inviting the wolf into the house. Tomobaye told the North Koreans that since the documents found on the rebels implicated them, it was up to them to provide a full and clear response before proceeding further in relations between the two countries. This seemingly hypocritical policy to establish closer diplomatic ties with a foreign government while also funding rebels at the same time was representative of its guerrilla internationalist foreign policy during the Cold War. Civil wars and conflicts opened spaces for Pyongyang to sell weapons and improve their own military tactics and capabilities. Also, by covertly doing so, the North Koreans simply denied any accusations and continued their military assistance programs around the world. The Angolan Civil War, which became a proxy war for Cold War superpowers, is the best representation of this in Africa. Officially, North Korea was never involved in this conflict. In May 1978, Kim Il-sung told Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu, quote, "On the occasion of the beginning of the clashes between the three national liberation groups in Angola, the DPRK broke relations with all three of them. Later, the relations were started with NATO's government, with which diplomatic relations were also established." Kim even scolded the Cubans for getting involved in Angola and told Ceausescu, "The Cubans were actually waging a war in Africa for someone else and with the support of someone else." He's referring to the someone else here as Soviet Union. The participation of the Cuban military in the battles in Africa was not helping the nations on this continent at all. Kim added, "The DPRK declared itself against such actions. The African states should be left alone to solve the problems between them by themselves." However, according to ROK Foreign Ministry reports and secondary sources, the DPRK actually assisted all three major warring groups of the Angolan Civil War. So they assisted the MPLA, UNITA, and FNLA at different points during a 27-year-long conflict. The duplicitousness of North Korean actions in Angola even earned them a reputation amongst foreign diplomats in Pyongyang. Zairian diplomats told Eric Cornell, a Swedish diplomat based in Pyongyang from 1975 to 77, that North Korean military instructors based in Zaire suddenly changed sides during the Angolan Civil War and began fighting with the MPLA against the Zairian government-assisted FNLA. In addition to Chad and Angola, North Koreans also supported non-state actors in southern Africa. However, this was for a far nobler cause, as the North Koreans trained and supplied anti-apartheid forces, such as the Southwest African People's Organization in Namibia, and even Nelson Mandela's African National Congress in South Africa. And this is something that you don't hear about in the press. You hear about Cuba's support of the ANC, and especially when Nelson Mandela relatively recently passed away. I believe Raul Castro even went to the service for Mandela. North Korea's backing of the SWAPO and ANC showcases the intersection of ideology and pragmatism in Kim Il-sung's foreign policy. In a 1986 speech, Kim Il-sung said, quote, "The South African racist regime pursues the vicious policy of apartheid, of racial discrimination, and the policy of brutal repression. It is trampling underfoot even the basic freedom and rights of the South African people and is keeping them subjugated to the white people who are the minority." This further emphasizes that Kim Il-sung based his Africa policy on solidarity with anti-colonial movements and idealistic hope for a unified global anti-imperialist front. However, Kim was also pragmatic and understood that insurgents could overturn African governments overnight. Supporting rebel groups was a way to both help the North Korean government's bottom line and its diplomatic presence on the continent. In addition to Africa, Kim Il-sung also supported anti-government forces in Latin America, especially in Mexico. The North Korean government trained 53 members of the Mexican Movement for Revolutionary Action, and I'll just call them MAR for short after this, from 1969 to 1970 in the DPRK. These Mexican revolutionaries had initially approached the Cubans, but Havana did not want to damage relations with the Mexican government at the time. So the Cubans introduced the MAR to the North Koreans. And you will see this throughout history that most of North Korea's relations with non-state actors, it primarily goes through one of their traditional allies, whether that is Iran, Syria, or Cuba in this case. The DPRK government quickly brought the Mexican revolutionaries over to Pyongyang via the Soviet Union. In North Korea, the MAR learned Taekwondo in military training camps and underwent rigorous physical training, such as running 5 hours at night with heavy sandbags over treacherous terrain. The training motto of these North Korean training camps was running, running, running. so it doesn't really sound like a lot of fun. After the arrest of 19 MAR members in February 1971, the North Korean connection was exposed to the Mexican public, and it quickly hit the front pages of Mexican newspapers. In response, the Mexican government denied DPR requests to establish a diplomatic mission in Mexico City. The South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that the incident revealed North Korea's wanton disregard of international peace and order that deserves condemnation by all freedom and peace-loving peoples throughout the world. In addition to the Mexican case, the most publicized North Korean support of rebels was in Sri Lanka. In April 1971, a North Korean funded and supplied dissident organization known as the People's Liberation Front attempted to overthrow the Sri Lankan government. The North Korean embassy in Colombo supplied the rebels with money, arms, and explosives. The government, which the local Sri Lankan press described as Tregavistas and Maoists, aimed to establish a pure social government on the island. And actually, during this time, the Sri Lankan government was leftist, but according to these North Korean trained and funded rebels, they weren't leftist enough. So this uprising failed, and the North Korean connection was quickly uncovered. The Sri Lankan government took immediate action and ordered the closure of the North Korean embassy. However, the chaos of the insurrection caused an island-wide school shutdown and curfew. During the Cold War, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Ho Chi Minh earned recognition around the world for being revolutionary leaders. This keeps cutting in and out. Okay. Although Kim Il-sung's role was less well known in the world revolutionary movement, the DPRK's role as a supporter of rebel groups did not go unnoticed by foreign governments. And this is actually a picture I took in North Korea when I went there in 2012. And I think it tells us something about the North Korean worldview. If you look at North Korea on this North Korean-made map, it's huge. It's roughly half the size of India. That's not even remotely geographically accurate. But it tells us something about how they see themselves. And that is, they see themselves as the center of the world, and they see themselves as being perhaps more important than their size would indicate. And there's actually a North Korean term for this, and that is, there can be no world without Chosun. And I think that this also applies to their policy when it comes to assisting non-state actors. They want to get involved in conflicts. And as I'll later talk about it, they've gotten involved in the civil war, in the Syrian civil war. And it also kind of applies to the current crisis between the U.S. and North Korea, and how North Korea tends to like to hit the front pages of major newspapers around the world. And so the DPRK's leadership, under the command of Kim Il-sung, applied guerrilla tactics and techniques to its foreign policy. Naturally, this extended to assisting guerrilla fighters around the world. By sowing discord and revolution abroad, Pyongyang enhanced its reputation as an anti-imperialist stalwart and defender of anti-colonial peoples. The North Korean government was willing to risk breaking bilateral relations with newly independent third world governments as it prioritized leftist revolution over international stability. While Soviet communism disappeared into the dustbin of history shortly before Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, the DPRK's revolutionary foreign policy in support of non-state actors continued under Kim Jong-il's rule. The successor to Kim Il-sung's rule, Kim Jong-il, experienced a radically different upbringing from his father. While the young Kim Il-sung forged his reputation through anti-Japanese resistance activities in 1930s Manchuria, Kim Jong-il lived his childhood in relative secrecy. Born in the Soviet Union and raised in North Korean palaces, Kim Jong-il experienced little hardship as a child and lived the life of a young royal. Unlike his father, Kim Jong-il was no guerrilla fighter. Nonetheless, Kim Jong-il was a masterful propagandist who, beginning in the 1970s, traced the genealogy of the North Korean Revolution back to the 1930s anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle in Manchuria. This pleased the This pleased the aging North Korean leadership, which enjoyed watching Kim Jong-il's revolutionary musical operas that focus on the exploits of the anti-Japanese guerrillas. And after gaining the respect of his father's old fighting buddies, Kim Jong-il secured his position as successor to Kim Il-sung and worked to increase his control over the military via managing the shadowy Organization and Guidance Department, or OGD, which is widely seen as the administrative center of the Korean Workers' Party and the Korean People's Army. In addition, the DPRK leadership continued to be primarily comprised of former guerrillas. At the 6th Korean Workers' Party Congress in 1980, Kim Jong-il was announced as a member of the Politburo. He was the youngest member of the 19-member committee, which included only former guerrillas, with the exception of Ok Koo-do, whose father was a guerrilla fighter. Despite Kim Jong-il not being a guerrilla fighter himself, the guerrilla tradition and its brand of guerrilla internationalism continued to shape and inform DPRK government policy during his reign. From the importance placed upon the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle in North Korean propaganda to the long-standing leadership of former guerrillas in the Politburo, the DPRK continued to adhere to the ethos of the guerrilla fighter during Kim Jong-il's rule. Rather than adapt to a globalized and interconnected world, the North Korean government continued the path of a guerrilla state. Thus, banditry, denial, trickery, and a paranoid fear of the outside world defined Kim Jong-il's foreign policy. However, a substantial shift occurred in the international arena of non-state actors. Gone were the days of communist guerrillas and freedom fighters opposing colonial regimes. The new firebrands on the global stage were religious radicals. However, Kim Jong-il's regime was selective in assisting such groups. Rather than indiscriminately supply any group with arms that could pay them in hard currency, the North Korean government primarily chose to assist groups with self-determination aims, such as the Tamil Tigers and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Thus, multinational jihadist groups with apocalyptic visions of establishing Sharia law around the world, such as Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and later the Islamic State, received little, if any, attention from the North Koreans. Even the North Koreans had limits. After the failed 1971 insurrection by DPRK-assisted rebels in Sri Lanka, the North Koreans continued to exert pressure on the Sri Lankan government to re-establish diplomatic relations. As U.S. archival documents explain, the Sri Lankan government had little interest in reestablishing ties with Pyongyang. Nonetheless, the North Koreans persisted and later reestablished a presence on the island via its support of a separatist organization, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or simply the Tamil Tigers. The Tamil Tigers sought to form an independent, ethnically Tamil state and religiously Hindu state in the northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka. According to Rohan Gutnaratna, head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research, the North Koreans started selling weapons to the Tamil Tigers in 1997. While information on this relationship is hard to come by, journalist Tom Farrell's firsthand account of the Sri Lankan Civil War suggests that North Korean weapons, such as rockets, specialized maritime equipment, and surface-to-air missiles, greatly assisted the Tamil Tigers during their war. This bloody conflict, which lasted from 1983 to 2009, killed more than 70,000 people. In addition to assisting the Tamil Tigers, Kim Jong-il's regime also began supplying another liberation group in southern Asia, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, with arms in the 1990s. This organization, seeking to create an independent state in the Filipino Mindanao region for the Moro people, first began buying weapons from the North Koreans in 1999. According to confiscated MILF, so they have an unfortunate name of their acronym being MILF. So according to confiscated MILF documents, the arms agreement between parties was worth around $2.2 million, which primarily consisted of rifles and grenades. These rebels later tried to purchase a submersible vessel from North Korea, but the deal never took place as Filipino security authorities were alerted. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the DPRK leadership had to find new sources of income to fund their nuclear program and extravagant lifestyles. Groups such as the Tamil Tigers and More Islamic Liberation Front provided vital amounts of energy of money to the DPRK leadership slush funds. However, it is important to note that the DPRK never conducted arms deals directly with multinational jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda. The North Koreans preferred making deals with groups that had less ambitious goals, such as what both parties perceived as rightful self-determination. Thus, North Korea viewed the Tamil Tigers and the Moro rebels as acceptable partners in the worldwide struggle against imperialism and colonialism. The North Koreans also established ties with Hezbollah and Hamas via their allies in Tehran and Damascus. These two groups needed weapons, and the North Koreans were willing to supply weapons to organizations that sought to destroy Israel, a close ally of the United States. Well, the DPRK's Israel policy is little researched. The North Koreans have been vehemently anti-Israel and pro-Palestine since the inception of the Israeli state in 1948. And during the course of my dissertation research, I've been trying to focus a little bit more on analyzing North Korea's Palestine policy and how they interpret Israel. And I found some images in the North Korean magazine Cholima of how they, and there's a visual depiction of an Israeli soldier, and it's very, very close to anti-Semitic fascist visuals from the World War II period. So the Israeli soldier has fangs and like snake fang-like teeth, and he's cowering. And in another depiction, he's perceived as accepting money from the United States. So I think there's almost a direct, I guess you could say, a direct transition from almost Nazi-era propaganda to North Korea propaganda in this way. The North Koreans also provided tunnel building expertise to Hezbollah and Hamas, developed from years of digging under the demilitarized zone in Korea. According to the U.S. court case Chaim Eplan et al. Versus Hezbollah, quote, prior to July 12, 2006, North Korea provided Hezbollah with assistance in building a massive network of underground military installations, tunnels, bunkers, depots, and storage facilities in southern Lebanon. Meanwhile, Israeli military commanders believe North Korea helped Hamas build tunnels that allowed their fighters to quickly pass undetected in and out of Gaza. While fostering chaos in Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and the Middle East proved to be profitable ventures for the DPRK government, Kim Jong-un had loftier ambitions for disrupting international order. Using high-quality presses, the DPRK government started producing counterfeit U.S. currency, infamously known as supernotes, in the late 1970s. It is no coincidence that North Korea's countercurrency scheme began at the same time as Kim Jong-il's rise to power. The U.S. government long suspected the North Koreans were behind the sudden appearance of the supernotes. They were nearly indistinguishable from the U.S. $100 bills. As the Treasury later revealed during its investigation, the North Korean government used members of subversive groups, namely official Irish Republican Army's Chief of Staff Sean Garland, to distribute the currency in Europe during the 1990s. According to a North Korean chemist who made the original design of the supernotes and later defected to South Korea, the goal of the option was to make money, but the secondary motive was inspired by anti-Americanism. Predictably, the North Koreans denied any connection to the counterfeit money and called it a vicious and mean smear campaign by the U.S. government. The mutually beneficial goal of bolstering the Korean Workers' Party's coffers while also establishing international stability and the U.S. economic system characterized Kim Jong-il's regime as evidenced by the above cases. Unfortunately, the North Korean people felt the greatest impact from this renegade foreign policy, experiencing a horrific famine that killed more than 600,000 people in the 1990s. The economic landscape of the post-Cold War world was dramatically different from the climate that Kim Il-sung faced. Thus, the funds from these groups partially filled the massive void left by the collapse of the communist bloc. Nonetheless, the guerrilla legacy inherited from his father pressed Kim Jong-il to continue a policy of guerrilla internationalism. After Kim Jong-il's sudden death in 2011, a period of optimism ensued. Would the new North Korean leader continue his family's brutal rule, or would he be different and open North Korea to the world? 6 years has passed since Kim Jong-un took power, and it's clear to most observers that Kim Jong-un is similar, if not worse, than his father in terms of repression. There appears to be no substantial changes in domestic policy under Kim Jong-un, besides the state begrudgingly accepting the reality of a black market system that emerged during the famine in the 90s. However, one of the major foreign policy changes under Kim Jong-un has been the discontinuation of direct support to non-state actors. Based on publicly available sources, it appears that North Korea has shifted away from assisting rebel groups and liberation movements. The lone exception is North Korea's continued assistance to Hezbollah through its contacts in Syria and Iran. The DPRK has indirectly sold Hezbollah via Damascus M600 series rockets, anti-tank missiles, and 2 Scud-D platforms. In a fashion similar to his forefathers, Kim Jong-un has successfully taken advantage of foreign civil wars, especially the recent conflict in Syria. North Korea still participates in international illicit networks such as arms smuggling, but most of those transactions are now conducted through front companies in foreign countries. And there was recently a really good article done on these front companies, one on in Malaysia. It was conducted by James Pearson of Reuters. And so I believe there are 3 possible explanations for this shift. First, groups are now aware that any association with Pyongyang will garner more negative attention than it is worth. North Korea is widely known for its affordable arms deals, but the risk of conducting those deals may now outweigh the benefits for groups such as the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which seek international attention and sympathy for their cause. In addition, purchasing weapons from North Korea is a blatant violation of UN sanctions, which could derail the legitimacy-seeking agendas of many non-state actors. Second, the international climate has changed. North Korea is aware that association with Islamist jihadist groups such as ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, or Al-Qaeda will bring the full force of the international community down on them. Traditional allies such as Russia and China face threats from radical Muslim insurgents in their own countries, specifically in China in Xinjiang and in Russia in Dagestan and Chechnya. If North Korea directly or indirectly assists any of those groups, those traditional allies may decide that North Korea has finally crossed the line and thus break off vital ties, economic ties, for Kim Jong-un's regime. In addition, the DPRK government no longer needs the funds from non-state actors due to a new form of guerrilla internationalism, hacking. Hacking is less costly, easier to perform, and harder to trace back to North Korea than arms deals with non-state actors. Hacking in many ways is 21st century guerrilla warfare. It is quick, dangerous, and can be performed in a hit-and-run fashion. It allows impoverished states like North Korea to disrupt the economy and stability of world superpowers such as the U.S. Hacking is one of the great economic equalizers for the regime in Pyongyang. Third, Kim Jong-un has shifted away from his forefathers' emphasis on promoting global revolution to a focus on brutal pragmatism and achieving the final victory of Korean unification under the DPRK flag. The removal of his uncle Jang Sung-taek from leadership and the assassination of his half-brother Kim Jong-nam in Malaysia with a WD-grade nerve agent are uncharacteristically brazen for Pyongyang and suggest that Kim Jong-un's initial focus was securing his grip on power within the North Korean leadership. In addition, unlike his father at the time of secession, Kim Jong-un is not constrained to pleasing aging former guerrillas. These men have mostly died, and the Politburo is filled with many new members. Kim Jong-un is not committed to any form of revolutionary assistance, nor does the Politburo care about continuing guerrilla internationalism. Kim Jong-un has successfully removed 2 potential sources of rivalry within the North Korean leadership and now seems determined to make North Korea into a nuclear weapons state and make the U.S. acknowledge it as such and carry out the DPRK's what they would call a final victory campaign of uniting the two Koreas under his rule. And instead of worrying whether North Korea will sell nuclear arms technology or information to ISIS, the international community would be better served enforcing sanctions on Pyongyang, devising new ways to deal with Kim Jong-un's increasingly sophisticated nuclear arsenal, and exposing the dangers and potential sale of DPRK missiles and chemical weapons. In 2004, Kim Jong-nam, president of the Presidium of the DPRK's Supreme People's Assembly, told U.S. journalist Selig Harrison, quote, "We're entitled to sell missiles to earn foreign exchange. But in regard to nuclear material, our policy, past, present, and future, is that we would never allow such transfers to al-Qaeda or anyone else. Never." While North Korea has thus far shown little interest in selling its nuclear technology to non-state actors, it has demonstrated that it is willing to sell chemical weapons to rogue states, such as Syria. This may be a thinly veiled attempt by Pyongyang to test the strength of their chemical weapons program via proxies. However, this North Korean-Syria relationship dates back to the late 1960s and is not a new phenomenon. Syria and Iran, which have historically been some of Pyongyang's closest allies, remain close to the Kim family regime today. The most likely way North Korean-made chemical weapons end up in the hands of non-state actors such as Hamas or Hezbollah is via one of these two groups. North Korea would most likely not directly sell chemical weapons to non-state actors, but use Syria or Iran as an intermediary. Unlike the international sale or transfer of nuclear weapons or technology, the sale of chemical weapons is more easily concealed and could potentially evade international surveillance. And as shown by the murder of Kim Jong-un with a WMD-grade nerve agent in the Kuala Lumpur airport, North Korea will not hesitate to use their chemical weapons in a public space and expose innocent people to them. Thus, it is feasible that Pyongyang tests the effectiveness of their chemical weapons on large populations that their allies in the Middle East deem expendable or threatening. This should be one of the primary concerns for the international community in dealing with North Korea's illicit activities and trade networks. One of the best ways of curbing North Korea's international sale of chemical weapons is to put the Kim family regime back on the U.S. government's list of state sponsors of terrorism. This would send a clear message to Pyongyang that its recent actions in Malaysia and its sale of chemical weapons to Syria do not go unpunished or unnoticed by the international community. It would also exert additional financial pressure on the Kim family regime and cut off Pyongyang's access to the U.S. banking system. While Kim Jong-un has stopped direct support of non-state actors, the DPRK's complex global network of trade partners and military agreements still entangles non-state actors as possible endpoints for North Korean weapons. As North Korea continues to violate international norms and treaties with its missile tests, placing the Kim family regime back on the state sponsors of terrorism list reminds Pyongyang that the U.S. will not retreat from its policy of maximum pressure. And also, before I end here, and while I have a platform, I just want to say that I'm currently on the job hunt for academic positions, think tank work, or government jobs related to North Korea. So if anyone has any leads, I'd appreciate hearing about them after this talk. Thank you.
Ben, when do you finish up at GW?
Is this thing out?
You gotta press the button.
It's a button. All right. So I'm currently finishing my dissertation, and I hope to be done with it by the end of next semester.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So May 2018. Yeah.
And thank you for that excellent presentation. It really recapped a lot of the main points in your talk, and I apologize about the mic. One of the things about moving into a new office is dealing with new technology. But I think you did a really great job. Notwithstanding. I just have one question before. I'm sure there's probably a lot of questions from the audience right now. And as it relates to what you said is the current shift away from non-state actors, dealing with non-state actors for North Korea, and you list three factors. First, that groups are now aware that any association with North Korea will garner more negative attention than it's worth. Second, the international climate has changed. And third, that Kim Jong-un has shifted away, when you define from brutal pragmatism, has shifted away from ideology to which was one half of the guerrilla internationalism to the brutal pragmatism. I was just wondering if you could assign sort of a weight to either one of them. To what role, which one of these things has played possibly a bigger role in the current shift, or are they sort of interrelated in any way?
Yeah, I think that is a good question. I believe that international climate changing is a big one, and the fact that China and especially Russia have to deal with a terrorist problem of their own, and they don't want any sort of North Korea fears that they could indirectly sell weapons, or if they were brazen enough, sell weapons to some of these groups, that they would directly undercut and undermine some of their key patron states. And also, they don't need it because hacking is very profitable, and North Korea seems to hack even relatively weak states such as Bangladesh. They hacked the National Bank of Bangladesh and stole a bunch of money from them, and they will hack. They hacked Sony. I think that's basically been accepted that it was most likely done by a North Korean state agent. And I think that the climate has changed, and that I would probably place more weight on that.
So I'm going to turn things over now to the audience. There may be some problems with the mic. If you hear a loud feedback noise, when you're standing up, please just move the mic down. It might be something to do with the speakers in the ceiling. If I can ask you to please state your name and affiliation before asking your question. We'll go to Patrick first.
Hi, Patrick, and DOD. I have a question about hacking.
Maybe just sit down.
Okay. This is better?
I think it's a little bit better.
Okay. Could you discuss how prevalent hacking is, and to what extent it contributes to North Korea's revenue streams, and what current or potential measures are there to curb it from happening?
So hacking is, I think in many ways, it kind of reflects North Korea's guerrilla approach, that they can simply deny it, and it's very hard to trace hackers. I think you could see that in the recent election and the turmoil involving Russia. And I think something that we need to think about in the future is North Korea using a Russia type of hacking in regards to South Korean political elections. And I'm actually surprised they haven't done this already, is using this kind of information weaponry, so to speak, to influence their basically brothers to the south. And when I speak about the final victory of North Korea uniting the two Koreas, that might seem totally unbelievable. But I think maybe one of the best voices when it comes to talking about the reunification and how North Korea's unification drive is B.R. Myers. And I don't agree with Brian on everything, but I think he included a quote recently that when you talk about ISIS and you talk about them wanting to establish Sharia law around the world, we know that's not possible, but that doesn't stop them from trying to advance that cause. And we need to think about North Korea's unification drive as being driven by a similar mindset. And that itself is dangerous.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. You said that there wasn't that much. I'm getting an echo. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going crazy here. That there wasn't that much change in a policy between the father and Kim Jong-un, the current. But if you listen to their, whether it's propaganda or pronouncements, they say that with Kim Jong-un, they introduced a new policy, which is this dual track, develop the economy in parallel with developing the military, particularly nuclear weapons program. And the North Korean foreign minister, in his speech at the UN, actually referred specifically to this dual policy. So I have read something saying, oh, they can't do it, it's impossible, it's just words. However, at least it was announced that they had a new policy.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the Pyongyang line, which is like the dual development, focusing on the economy and nuclear development at the same time. I think that's maybe not like the main ideology that is basically guiding the regime. It's a line, and there's a difference between the two, and I think that Kim Jong-un has benefited from an improving economy, especially in Pyongyang, and also the fact that he has a degree of popularity that his father never had. I mean, North Korean defectors, they still say very positive things about Kim Il-sung, but when it comes to Kim Jong-il, he was almost like universally detested. If a leader can be detested in North Korea, but he's not as popular as Kim Il-sung. But I think the propaganda apparatus in North Korea has succeeded in tying Kim Jong-un to his grandfather. It can be based on looks. It can be based on their similarity in the way they dress and how how freely he speaks. Kim Jong-il never really talked in public, but Kim Jong-un kind of has this bravado around him and this kind of charisma that's very reminiscent of his grandfather.
John Burton, excuse me, John Burton with the Korea Times. Why didn't you mention North Korea's involvement during the Zimbabwe Civil War and the notorious North Korean trained 5th Brigade?
Yeah, so I talk about that in my dissertation. So, but for the purposes of this paper, I think that I could include it as a non-state actor, because during that time, but I think during that time, Mugabe, he was actually the leader of Zimbabwe, and he was trying to oust political rivals in the Metabeliland. But he wasn't a non-state actor at that point in time, so that's why I didn't include it in this paper. But in my dissertation, I do talk about it quite a bit, and it's a fascinating part of North Korea's exploitation of its military instructors and how they basically have conducted political violence around the world. And for those that don't know, in the mid-1980s, North Korea sent around 100 instructors to help Mugabe consolidate his political power in newly independent Zimbabwe. And these North Korean instructors then went to a region in Zimbabwe that was very much against Mugabe, and they killed these North Korean Zimbabwe soldiers killed 20,000 people. Some would say that's it was an ethnic cleansing of sort because it was primarily against a minority ethnic group there. But thank you for your question.
Stanley Kober. You end by recommending maximum pressure, and realistically, that's what we've been doing.
Yeah.
And so have China and Russia. You mentioned Russia at the end. This is something that puzzles me about the current regime in North Korea. You would think that they would implement the policy of divide and conquer. They wouldn't want to use a policy that would shove every other major country, including their closest former allies, into a closer position of putting pressure on them. But that seems to be what they're doing. Even rhetorically, what's coming out of Pyongyang toward Beijing. Do you have any explanation of why they are, doing this, of antagonizing everybody?
I think that the North Korea-China relationship isn't as cozy as it's been represented at times. China, to some extent, needs North Korea. I think they would rather have the Kim family regime border them than a unified Korean state that possibly has U.S. troops there. But I don't think that the North Korean leadership thinks very highly of the Chinese. They see them as basically being ideological revisionists, as selling out on the cause. So I think North Korea, they have this, as I talk about, one of my main arguments is that it's a guerrilla country. It doesn't really care too much about what the world thinks of them. They see themselves as the center. And they know that China kind of has to support them to some extent. That they've basically they kind of won when it comes to their dealings with China, and I don't think that the current regime in Beijing is willing to deal with any change because the Beijing they value stability over anything else.
Good, thank you. Mark Tokola from KEI. Does the current North Korean state ideology still contain any elements of revolutionary fervor for helping oppressed peoples around the world? Or is it more trying to portray themselves as a responsible international actor now?
So they still superficially support oppressed peoples. Sometimes they actually include remarks about the racial divide in the United States currently. But then, on the other hand, they called Barack Obama a black monkey. So you have kind of this duality of them saying, oh, look at how bad the U.S. is, all this racial violence, and then at the same time, they refer to world leaders in racist epithets. So I think right now it's very superficial, but in the past it hasn't always been so superficial. And they still have friendship societies in the third world. And when I say the third world, I talk about this in my dissertation, but I don't mean it as in a negative sense. Back during the Cold War era, it was actually a term of empowerment. They were seeking a third style of civilization that wasn't Soviet-style socialism or American-style liberal democracy. And North Korea actually used the term third world as well as a positive term. So they still have friendship societies in the third world. There's a recent BuzzFeed, of all things BuzzFeed, had a great article about a North Korean friendship society and pro-DPRK figures in Nigeria, and these people really believed that North Korea was great, even though it was geographically remote. They thought it was great because they kind of stuck it to the world. And I think that kind of very rebellious attitude resonates with some people still today. But I would say they're third world solidarity compared to Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung periods is relatively superficial. I just don't think they care enough about it anymore because the international climate is so different. Global capitalism essentially won.
Henry Hedger, researcher, NARA. I thought I'd ask about that photo of Jill in China, 1938, the Korean guerrillas. I wondered, where is this located? What kind of guerrillas are they? Are they from North or South Korea? What is the composition? Are they allied with Mao or are they allied with the Chinese government? How did all this occur? Were there two branches of Korean guerrillas or is there simply one that was shown?
Yeah, so the early days of Kim Il-sung are quite muddled. I think some of the best works on that are Dae Suk-soo's book. I think the title of it is Kim Il-sung. But also, Kim Il-sung, they were in his band of partisans, they were actually allied with the Chinese communists. And they worked very closely with them in northeastern China. But there was an incident in 1932 called the Minsangdan incident, when the Chinese communists basically purged all of the Korean nationalists from their group. And there are some historians that think that this really left a stain on Kim Il-sung's memory of China, and why he never, like, there's an old saying there, the China-North Korean relationship is as close as lips to teeth. But in reality, when you look at Kim Il-sung's private conversations with Eastern European leaders, he never really trusted the Chinese. And I think a lot of this could go back to his guerrilla days, when they were closely allied with the Chinese communists. But then in this incident, basically because of racial racism, the Chinese communists thought the Koreans were Japanese spies. And so they killed a number of them, a number of Kim Il-sung's closest Korean nationalistic friends in this group. And I think this did leave a stain on Kim Il-sung's memory and how he dealt with the Chinese. And in my research, I really do stress upbringings and how much an upbringing can have an influence in your later development. And it's almost kind of like I'm crossing maybe like psychology and history in a way, almost like I didn't intend to do it. It wasn't intentional, but I think that the way you're raised in your child has a huge bearing on your development, and this is also true in how a dictator views the world.
Take a question in the back.
Virgil Strohmeyer, State Department. What about the Han network, and would it be Kim Il-sung or Kim Sung-il or whom? Or the Khan network connection with the Koreans, North Koreans?
The what connection?
The Khan network, Mr. Khan from Pakistan.
Oh, the Khan network with Pakistan. Okay. And how A.Q. Khan sold weapons to the North Koreans? Yeah. So I don't know like the ins and outs of those dealings. But in the course of my dissertation research, I have looked at Pakistan's relations with North Korea. And Pakistan was one of the primary spaces of North and South Korean competition. They tried to vie for diplomatic recognition from Pakistan. And after Bhutto took power, it really changed to be more pro-North Korea. And there was very much a pro-North Korea climate in Pakistan, and A.Q. Khan kind of almost took advantage of it, and he used the presence of this climate to essentially begin deals secretly with the North Koreans. But if like the specifics of the NGO and stuff, I really don't know.
Alex from Treasury. I'd like to go back for a minute to the hacking issue. When you're talking about hacking, are you referring to, are you seeing the hijacking information and holding that information for ransom? Are you seeing the hacking of bank accounts and direct transfer of funds to North Korean accounts? And I'm curious, at what volume have you seen that so far relative to their greater revenues? I'm curious how that might continue, how that progression might mitigate the economic sanctions that we place on the regime going forward.
So I'm not a hacking expert per se, and there's no way that you can really verify that North Korea did it. But I think based on I think maybe the two cases that we can really pin down that North Korea did it was the National Bank of Bangladesh being hacked, and also the Sony being hacked when it came out with that movie. So, and one thing is that they don't want anything. They basically anything that directly opposes the regime, especially if it's as violent as that movie, they don't want their leader essentially being beheaded. and then also when it comes to funds, so you could say that one is information on one hand and one is funds on the other. And also they've tied the recent the WannaCry ransomware attack. Some security firms have tied that to North Korea as well. But there's some suspicions that it wasn't them. So that's one of the things that I think North Korea, they can kind of thrive on as being a hacker. It very much suits their guerrilla style approach. It can't be traced back. It's quick hit and run fashion, and it's cheap. And they can essentially groom children from birth to be a hacker, and it's very much a lucrative job and prestigious job in North Korea. And there's also some suspicions that the Pyongyang Institute of Science and Technology, PUST, actually they are essentially unintentionally training the next hackers of North Korea. I think at this time it'd probably be a good time to essentially cut off aid to that institution. It's just the current climate today should not. You should try to seize all ties with a country as deplorable as North Korea. And I've switched. I used to be very much pro-engagement, but I went to North Korea in 2012, and I went with a group called Pyongyang Project, and most of the people in my group were very pro-engagement. I just graduated from college, and I was like, oh, North Korea's gonna change. It's gonna be great. It's gonna open. And it was right when Kim Jong-un took power, and nothing has really changed, and I've only seen that the negative benefits of engagement with that regime, from Otto Warmbier being imprisoned and then brought back in a coma and then later dying, to just the effects of the failure of the Sunshine Policy and the fact that North Korea is now essentially a nuclear state. And I think that it's also a country that doesn't care about international norms. When you use a WMD grade nerve agent in an international airport, that's not normal. That is a guerrilla state, and it should be treated as a guerrilla state, and you should isolate them as much as possible. You should treat North Korea the way that the world treated apartheid South Africa, and that means kicking them out of international sports competitions, even the Olympics. So I've come down, I've basically made the whole big change around, and that the world should start treating North Korea very much similar to apartheid South Africa.
Thank you. Milton Honig from International Center for Terrorism Studies. I believe you quoted someone saying that North Korea would transfer, say, technology, but not something like nuclear materials.
Yeah.
These days, some people are talking about possibility of North Korea transferring nuclear weapons to Iran.
Yep.
What do you feel about that statement?
So I think that that quote that I included from Kim Jong-nam is very telling, although it was in 2004. I honestly do not think that they would sell nuclear technology to foreign powers, because North Korea, they're very good at being on the line, as toting a fine line between going over it and kind of still being aggressive but not too aggressive into a full-out war. And I think they know that selling nuclear technology to a country like Iran or to a non-state actor would be crossing the line. North Korea, throughout time, they've demonstrated they can get right up to that line and then pull back, whether it's in 1968 with the Pueblo incident and the Blue House raid, or recently with the bombing of the South Korean island and then the Chonan incident as well. They're really good at getting right up to the line but then pulling back. And I think the leadership knows that when dealing with arms for nuclear material to Iran would be going over that line.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify what you mean by nuclear technology.
Yep.
Because North Korea was building a production reactor, nuclear reactor in Syria, which was destroyed by the Israelis. So here we have them transferring nuclear technology, but not materials or weapons. Okay.
Yeah.
Seeing that there are no further questions, this is a good time to naturally end it right here. Thank you very much for putting up with the feedback and working through us on that. And thank you very much to Ben for this really great program. And again, just wanted to remind you, 2 upcoming programs that we have. On Tuesday the 10th, we'll have our open house reception. And then on Monday the 16th, we're having a program on how North Korea is being reported on in the media. So please join me in thanking Ben Young for his presentation.